The airport was already awake before the sun had fully risen. Travelers hustled past, dragging luggage and sipping coffee, their faces set with routine urgency. At gate B-17, an elderly man approached the check-in counter, his steps slow but steady. His jacket, once crisp and proudly worn, now hung with age. A faded army green with patches and insignias that had stories of blood, sacrifice, and valor sewn into every thread. He gently placed a weathered duffel bag on the scale, its leather, corners scuffed and frayed. It looked like it had been to war and back, much like the man who carried it. His face was marked with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much and said too little. Without looking up from her screen, the airline agent muttered, "That'll be $50 for the carry-on." There was no hesitation in her tone, no pause to acknowledge the military patches or the Silver Medal of Honor ribbon barely peeking from beneath the coat's collar. She didn't see the name Sergeant, First Class John M. Thomas embroidered above the heart. She didn't know he had once pulled wounded men from a burning tank under enemy fire, or that he had spent 2 years recovering from injuries he never once mentioned. John didn't argue. He didn't speak of honor, or medals, or service. With slightly shaking hands, he pulled out his wallet, worn and thin, and quietly began counting the bills. A moment passed. Then another. Several feet away, near a vending machine, a young Army lieutenant waited for his flight. Dressed in his pressed uniform, he casually glanced around the terminal, and then he froze. His eyes locked on the older man's jacket, on the name stitched there. He blinked, stunned. His mouth fell open slightly as he whispered under his breath, "No way. That's him." The lieutenant, David Carter, had spent his entire officer training hearing stories of a hero named John M. Thomas, a man who had saved his entire unit in a battle overseas. David had seen his face in the Hall of Heroes, read about his valor in training manuals, even quoted him in a leadership essay. But now, that very man was being asked to pay $50 for a bag, and no one noticed him. No one cared. David's pulse quickened. He looked around. How could everyone be so blind to the presence of a living legend? He knew then something had to be done. This was more than about a bag. It was about respect, about memory, about a nation's promise to never forget. Inside the narrow confines of the aircraft, the usual boarding chatter echoed. The shuffle of feet, the clink of carry-ons in overhead bins, flight attendants giving practice smiles. The hum of routine masked what was anything but ordinary happening in seat 22F. Sergeant First Class John M. Thomas sat quietly near the rear of the plane. He had chosen a window seat, tucked away where he could stare at the clouds in silence. As passengers walked past him, squeezing into rows and sorting their luggage, John nodded politely, offering gentle smiles to anyone who glanced his way, though few did. Most were too preoccupied with finding space or scrolling through their phones. No one saw the history in his eyes or the subtle limp that remained from a shrapnel wound earned decades ago in a jungle far from here. Then, halfway through boarding, a young soldier stepped onto the plane. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid. Lieutenant David Carter. As he moved down the aisle, his eyes scanned the rows casually, until he saw the old man. His breath caught in his throat. The name on the jacket was unmistakable. He'd seen it in textbooks, heard it spoken with reverence at the academy. This wasn't just a soldier. This was the Sergeant Thomas, the one who dragged 5 men from a burning convoy under heavy fire, the one who refused evacuation until the last of his brothers had been rescued. David stopped dead in his tracks. He stepped closer, almost hesitant. Then, in front of the watching passengers, he snapped to attention and saluted. "Sir, is it really you?" John looked up, his eyes tired but kind. He gave a soft smile. "That was a long time ago, son." David swallowed hard. "It still matters." Without another word, he turned and moved swiftly back up the aisle, heart pounding. As soon as he cleared the jet bridge, he pulled out his phone with shaking hands. There was only one number to call. General Harlan Avery, now a high-ranking officer at the Pentagon, had once been a young corporal under Thomas's command. David barely waited for the line to connect. "General Avery, this is Loudon Carter," he said, voice taut with urgency. "Sir, he's here, Sergeant Thomas. They made him pay for his bag." A beat of silence on the other end, then a single grave reply. "Don't let that plane take off." Just as the last few passengers were sliding into their seats and overhead bins thudded shut, the cabin lights dimmed in preparation for takeoff. Flight attendants moved down the aisle performing final checks, and the pilot's calm voice announced that they'd be departing momentarily. Everything was proceeding as expected, until it wasn't. Back at the gate, the sound of firm, measured footsteps cut through the usual airport noise. Heads turned, conversation stopped. A four-star general, tall, commanding, and unmistakably in full-dress uniform, strode toward the gate with a presence that turned every head. Behind him trailed two airport security officers, clearly unsure of what was about to happen, but following without question. General Harlan Avery, chest-lined, with medals, eyes sharp with decades of leadership, didn't pause to explain. He stepped directly in front of the gate agent and pointed at the jet bridge. "Stop boarding, nobody moves," he said, voice calm but immovable. The gate agent blinked in confusion. "Sir, I don't understand. The flight is already nearly full." I said, "Stop it." He held up a hand and turned toward the airline supervisor, now rushing over. "There's a Medal of Honor recipient on that plane, and your people made him pay for a carry-on. That ends right now." Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. A flight attendant paused mid-safety demo. The pilot's voice crackled back to life over the intercom, uncertain. We've just been notified of a delay at the gate. Please remain seated." Passengers exchanged glances. Some rolled their eyes. A few pulled out their phones, beginning to record. But then, as the whispers spread, the tone changed. "Did he say Medal of Honor?" Someone murmured. "Who?" another asked. "What's going on?" The murmuring grew, louder. Back at the terminal, the gate agent picked up the phone. Moments later, a message came through the aircraft's speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay due to a matter of honor. We appreciate your patience." The cabin fell quiet. In row 22F, John M. Thomas sat still, unaware of the chaos unfolding just outside. He looked out the window, the sun just beginning to rise above the horizon. His hands rested gently in his lap, unaware that history was catching up to him, that after years of quiet service and humility, someone had finally stood up and said, "This man matters." The cabin remained hushed, the kind of silence usually reserved for moments of awe, not delay. Row by row, passengers whispered, looked around, checked their phones, but no one really understood what was happening. Until the curtain at the front of the plane pulled aside and two flight attendants made their way to the back. They stopped in front of seat 22F, where John M. Thomas sat, eyes still on the clouds outside the window. "Sir," one of them said, gently, "we'd like to move you to first class." John turned, surprised. "Oh, I appreciate that," he said with a warm smile, "but I'm fine where I am." He wasn't being modest. He meant it. The cramped seat and narrow window suited him just fine. He'd spent worse nights in foxholes and on medevac choppers. Comfort wasn't what he'd ever served for. Before the attendants could respond, the hush deepened. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the aisle. Every passenger leaned out just slightly to see. There in full uniform, General Harlan Avery made his way slowly through the narrow path, each step commanding reverent silence. When he reached row 22, he stopped in front of John. Their eyes met. For a moment, the decades seemed to melt away. 2 men, 2 soldiers, brothers in arms, bound by something more than rank or medals, by memory, by sacrifice. The general straightened, then gave a crisp salute. John, still seated, looked up with quiet humility. Then, in an unexpected gesture, General Avery dropped to one knee in the cramped space of the economy cabin. He reached up and gently unclipped the Medal of Honor from John's chest. The passengers around them gasped, not in alarm, but in reverence. Avery then placed the medal over his own heart and looked around the cabin. "I'm not just honoring this man," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of the engines. "I'm reminding this nation what sacrifice looks like, what humility, courage, and brotherhood feel like. This is a man who gave everything and never asked for anything." There was a beat, and then someone stood. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire plane rose to its feet, passengers standing shoulder to shoulder in the narrow aisles, applause swelling into something thunderous. A raw, emotional, uncontrollable wave of gratitude filled the aircraft. John's eyes welled, but he didn't cry. He simply nodded, the same way he had so many years ago when asked to do the unthinkable. But for the first time in a long while, someone saluted him, and the whole world watched. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft gently pushed back from the gate, the applause faded into a reverent quiet. The cabin lights dimmed once more, and passengers settled into their seats. But something had changed. The silence now carried weight, not of inconvenience but of understanding. Host David Carter had quietly taken the seat beside John in row 22F, refusing the comfort of his own first-class upgrade. His eyes were still wide from everything that had unfolded. The general, the medal, the applause, but John was calm, steady, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. David leaned in and asked softly, "Why didn't you say anything, sir? About the bag? Who you were? All of it?" John didn't look away from the window. The sun had started to rise above the horizon, casting soft gold over the wing as the plane ascended. "I didn't serve to be noticed," he said, voice low, thoughtful. "I served so others wouldn't have to carry the weight I did." David sat back, quietly absorbing the words. No lectures, no bitterness, just truth. As the plane soared higher, breaking through the clouds into a sea of light, the world below seemed smaller, quieter. Down there remained the terminal, the gate, the careless transaction over a $50 bag. But up here in this cabin, a man's legacy had come to life, not through his own words, but through the actions of those who remembered. The camera pans wide, or in the mind's eye, the narrator's voice carries gently. Sometimes, the heaviest things we carry can't be weighed, not in pounds or in dollars. Sometimes it's the silence of sacrifice, the burden of memory, the cost of doing what's right without ever asking for thanks. The jet slices through morning light, steady and strong. Today a nation paused, not for a medal, but for a man. And in that pause something shifted. Ignorance gave way to honor. Indifference bowed to dignity, and the forgotten weight of one man's bag reminded us all what it truly means to carry something for someone else. And with that, the story lands not in headlines or ceremonies, but in the hearts of those who watched, those who clapped, and those who understood. The plane carried them forward. So did his legacy.